In this video, I'm going to break down exactly why the 4% rule could ruin your retirement and what you need to be doing instead. See, every year I spend hundreds of hours helping my clients make consistent and sustainable decisions with their investments to guide them to a happy and stress-free retirement. But the truth is, following generalized basic advice like the 4% rule is one of the top ways to not achieve your goals in retirement. And that is exactly what we're going to be covering in today's video. We're going to be walking through exactly why the 4% rule is the wrong way to approach investment withdrawals and what you should be doing instead. With that being said, let's jump straight into the video. So let's begin by doing a quick explanation of what the 4% rule is. The 4% rule states that on the day you retire, you would take your portfolio's value and then determine your withdrawal amount each year in retirement based off of the starting value of the first year's portfolio value. I'll show an example on the screen here, but the idea is you would take 4% of the starting portfolio value, and then you would inflate that by the rate of inflation of the previous year for every year in retirement. And this 4% rule comes from a study that showed that with a very close to 100% level of confidence in any financial circumstance or any market circumstance, the portfolio would not have run out of money over the course of the test's lifespan, meaning that this would get an 100% certainty or 100% probability of not running out of money while alive if you were to follow this 4% rule. Now, let me show you on the screen what the math actually looks like for this. On the screen here, we have a hypothetical starting portfolio value of $2,173,000. 4% of that starting portfolio value is $86,920, and you can see that here. And let's assume for the purpose of this illustration that there's 3% inflation each year. Well, the 4% rule would state that in your first year, your first distribution or withdrawal amount that you could take would be $86,920. And then for the remainder of your retirement, you would be able to withdraw 3% more each year. That would compound year after year. So in year 2, it would be 89,000 and change. In year 3, 92,000 and change, and so on and so forth. And you can see that here for a range of years. Now, the biggest problem with the 4% rule among many, which we'll go through all of them in a second here, is I believe a psychological problem. It's the psychological problem that I call decision-making friction. Decision-making friction is the difficulty or inability to make a decision when we have we have to pick one proper roadmap among a complex range of possible action items, and we have to rely on ourselves to make that decision. And it's very, very difficult because the consequences are high if we were to get the decision wrong. And so decision-making friction intentionally gums up the works a little bit so that we have to put a little more thought, effort, and intention into choosing the right course of action. Now, the 4% rule is what I would call a very oversimplified, hard and fast rule that helps avoid decision-making friction. The problem is that most of us don't understand the trade-offs when we choose these hard and fast rules so that we can bypass this decision-making friction. And the whole objective of today's video is to explain the reasons that the 4% rule is not satisfactory and can derail your retirement, and then also present solutions and an alternative that you can use or consider using if you want to resolve this. So let's go through the list of problems that I have with the 4% rule. On the screen here, I've got 8 problems. The first is that the 4% rule is rigid. It really doesn't follow normal human spending behavior, and I believe that this sets you up for failure. And the reason that this doesn't follow normal human spending behavior is because it's too linear and it presents too many opportunities to ask questions that are not easy to answer. And so in most cases, humans don't stick to plans that are too strict and too rigid for any long period of time. The best analogy for this would be like weight loss. Giving yourself a crash diet that has very simple rules to follow, but is very difficult to execute because there's no flexibility, is a pretty surefire way not to stick with the diet. Problem number 2 with the 4% rule is that it assumes a 30-year retirement. And not everyone's gonna have a 30-year retirement. Some people might have 20 years, some people might have 40. And so following the 4% rule blindly because we've heard about this 4% rule but don't understand the context behind it can be catastrophic. You can either have a shorter retirement and end up passing away with a huge pile of money that you never spent and might have been overly restrictive in not spending while alive, or you could end up with a much longer retirement and think that the 4% rule would give you this 100% probability of not running out of money, just to find out that it only applies to 30-year time horizon. The third problem with the 4% rule is that it assumes that you have a 50% bond to stock allocation. And everyone's investment portfolio is going to be pretty unique. It's going to be case by case. So the fact that the 4% rule is only on this 50-50 allocation means it's very hard to drag and drop this rule onto other portfolio constructions. So just take that for what it's worth. Problem number 4 is that the 4% rule is based on historical data. And while history is a good guide and does give us information, history rarely repeats itself exactly as it occurred. And so we don't know what the future has in store, and making restrictive spending decisions in retirement based on historical data could be a way to regret passing away having not spent the money you've worked so hard to save. Problem number 5, the 4% rule assumes that you want a 100% level of confidence of not running out of money while alive. We do many things where we don't require a 100% level of confidence. It's a case-by-case item to discover or decide on your own. The issue here is that since it assumes that you want a 100% level of confidence, it's intentionally overly conservative, right? Because it has to work in 100% of scenarios. So it's intentionally overly conservative. And you'll see this come into play when we show some of the math on the screen. Problem number 6, the 4% rule does not factor in portfolio performance. The 4% rule says you draw 4% of the starting portfolio value from year 1 of retirement and then adjust that for inflation year by year, regardless of how the portfolio performs. Your portfolio might perform great some years and perform worse other years. And if you're not adjusting your income based on portfolio performance, you might be leaving money on the table, or you might be taking on too much risk in either direction. Problem number 7 here, the 4% rule does not include the effect of taxes or fees. And so depending on how your assets are located, if they're in tax-free accounts, tax-deferred accounts, or taxable accounts, or the split between those, will change the distribution rate that you can manage. And so following a flat 4% rule without any regard for where your assets are situated is a problem. And number 8 here is that the 4% rule creates more questions than it answered. I've already kind of alluded to that. And I'm going to show an exact scenario that kind of brings us to reality. But a really strict, rigid system that creates more questions than answers is hard to follow, because you end up stumped at some point saying, what do I do now if it doesn't go to plan? I'm going to show that in just a couple seconds here. If I were to summarize these 8 problems into the 3 core problems that I believe exist with the 4% rule, I would summarize it as follows. The first problem is, since it's so conservative, you have a high likelihood of passing away with a pile of money that was unspent and maybe regretting not having spent more in the youth of your retirement or throughout your retirement. That's big problem number 1. Big problem number 2 is what I call the surprise expense problem. What happens when you can't follow the 4% rule exactly and you distribute 5.5% one year instead of 4? Now you're stumped, and the question is, how do I change my plan? Do I even change my plan? What do I do when things don't go to plan? And the 4% rule doesn't really provide any structure for that. I'm going to show that on the screen. And the third high-level problem is, I believe the 4% rule either sets you up to fail or sets you up to be disappointed at the end of your life. So let's look at a couple of these problems. The first problem is the end of life, too much assets problem. You didn't spend enough. So let me show you a quick on the screen here, what happens based on different growth rates. Since the 4% rule doesn't have any factoring of your portfolio performance, one of the big problems is if your portfolio performs well and the rates of return you get are good, you're going to end your life with a huge pile of money that didn't get spent, and you might have regretted behaving so conservatively, working so hard to save all that money just to behave so conservatively, just to leave a big pile of money. And there's no problem with leaving a great legacy or estate to your heirs. That's great. You can totally plan for that. But let me show you what happens here. Let's assume that you have a 4% rate of return on your portfolio. The ending portfolio value after a 30-year retirement using the 4% rule would be roughly $150,000 off of that starting $2.17 million example I showed a few seconds ago. And that means it's basically a break even. And that's what the 4% rule says will happen in all scenarios. At the very worst scenario, you would break even. But what happens if you have a 6% growth rate? Now you've spent 4% each year. You have limited your spending and constrained it. You end your life with an almost $3 million pool of assets. And you might sit there and look and say, dang, I wish I could have spent more of that. It's great to leave money to my kids, but I don't know that I need to leave them this much. What happens with 8%? All of a sudden now you have an $8 million portfolio you're leaving at the end of life. And unless you're uber rich and really have no spending constraints, you're probably kicking yourself and saying, man, I wish I had a more flexible spending plan. It's great to leave this money. I don't regret it, but I wish I'd had a more flexible spending plan. So this is an example of that kind of regret at the end of life problem. The second problem I'm going to show here is what I call the surprise expense problem. So let's say in year 1, your distribution is $86,920. Again, using that same starting value of $2,170,000 roughly. Let's say at the end of the year, you have a surprise home repair that requires an additional $30,000 distribution. Now your new year 1 distribution is $116,000 and change. And your new year 1 distribution rate is 5.38% instead of 4%. What do you do? I don't know. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not telling you there's not an answer for it, but the 4% rule certainly doesn't provide that answer. It doesn't tell you what you do if in certain years you can't follow the 4% rule exactly, right? So the idea here is just it creates more questions. And the surprise expense problem is a very real problem that almost all retirees are going to face. You're going to face surprise expenses that are not factored into the way your spending plan goes because life is full of surprises. Okay, so we've really nailed the reasons the 4% rule is a problem. What is the solution? So I believe there are more human ways to manage distribution strategies in retirement. My favorite and preferred method is what I call the guardrail strategy. And this is a strategy that factors in portfolio performance and human behavioral spending patterns to give you simple, easy to follow rules and benchmarks that allow you to maximize the value of your saved assets and spend the most that you can in a safe way while still leaving a legacy goal if you choose to do so. So let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. What is a guardrail strategy? A guardrail strategy says when you retire, your portfolio is valued at a certain dollar amount. And because it's valued at that dollar amount, you can withdraw X dollars per month or per year. What I'm showing on the screen here says if you have this $2,173,000 portfolio on the day you retire, you can withdraw $8,800 roughly per month in retirement. And then what it says is we're going to place an upper bound and a lower bound. The lower bound is the point at which you need to cut spending because your portfolio has reached a level of risk that now warrants a spending cut. And the upper bound is a point at which the portfolio grows and you can increase how much you can spend in retirement because you've now earned kind of a step up. And on the screen, you can see that. And you can set guardrails kind of similar to Monte Carlo or probability of success on a retirement plan. And you can set them to give you either an 100% certainty of not running out of money while alive or an 80 or a 70. And I'll show a couple examples. But in this example on the screen here, this hypothetical scenario, they could spend $8,800 per month while their portfolio value is anywhere between $1.23 million and $2.415 million. At the top bound, they can increase their spending, and at the bottom bound, they would decrease their spending. Now, let's look at a comparison of this against the 4% rule, because that's really what matters. The first and most important way to compare it is what I have on the screen here, is spending flexibility. We highlighted that with the 4% rule, you don't have a lot of rules or a lot of information to follow that can help guide you when things don't go to plan. Well, a guardrail situation helps significantly with that. And let me show you the spending flexibility scenario here. Let's say you want to spend $70,000 in retirement. According to the guardrail that we just showed, you can spend up to $117,000 per year in retirement. You only want to spend $70,000, so technically you have $47,000 of spending flexibility that could be spent or not spent depending on your preferences. And you know that as long as the portfolio value remains between $2,173,000 and $1,342,000, that you can spend up to $117,000. You also know that you would cut spending by 5% to $111,000 when you hit this trigger, this lower bound. And in that way, you have a very easy to follow set of rules that you can start each year and don't have to do hard mental math. You can just say, oh, I know I can spend this amount till my portfolio hits that bottom bound. I don't have to change my spending behaviors. And if it does hit that bottom bound, I know exactly how much I'm going to change it by. And this gives you some more flexibility with your rules. Now, the second and most impressive part about how the guardrail strategy can improve on the 4% rule or be better is in how much money you can actually spend in your retirement in the times when it's most important to you. And that's critically important. So let me show you. On this screen, I'm going to show you 4 scenarios. I'm going to show you the static 4% rule, how much money a hypothetical person could withdraw in the first 10 years of their retirement if they were to retire at 61 through age 70 and their portfolio was their only income source. I'm going to show you how much the total they would withdraw, and then we're going to go and side-by-side comparison show different variations of conservative to more aggressive guardrail strategies and how much more money that person would be able to withdraw and use in the youth of their retirement. So if someone were to follow the 4% rule, we're looking at this scenario here, they would withdraw somewhere around just under $1 million in total in the first 10 years of their retirement, following the 4% rule and just inflating it very simply. When we scroll over to the next scenario here, we're going to look at a portfolio guardrails scenario where the person has the most conservative guardrail strategy, meaning the tightest bands on the tightest band to the downside, and has an 100% likelihood of not running out of money while alive if you follow those guardrails. And in this scenario, you can see that the total dollar amount in the first 10 years that this person could withdraw is around $1,140,000, which is $143,000 more than were they to follow the 4% rule. And you'd be achieving roughly the same level of probability of success. The 4% rule says 100% probability of success across different market scenarios. The guardrail scenario offers that same level of confidence. And so all you're really doing is trading up, and you have an easier system to follow that has more flexible rules that tell you when to change your spending behaviors based on your actual portfolio's performance. And you can see here where it's really meaningful is in the year-by-year difference in how much this person can spend. They can spend $16,000 more in year one, almost $16,000 more in year two, basically roughly $16,000 a year more in the first 10 years of their retirement. And that's significant money, and you still achieve a very high level of probability of success. And then if we move over, we can look at a guardrail scenario where there's an 80% probability of success instead of 100. Maybe you're okay with a little more risk and you want to spend more and front load it in the youth of your retirement. In this scenario, in the first 10 years, you would distribute roughly $1,250,000, which is $255,000 more than in the 4% rule scenario. You have an 80% probability of success, which is a great probability of success. In most cases, for financial plans we build, we're looking for somewhere between 70% and 90%. If you're above 90%, there's only two great reasons to be above 90%. One is you're so anxious that you can't sleep at night and you need to see that probability number. The second is you have so much money that you actually cannot figure out how to spend the money in order to bring the probability of success lower than 90%. You just can't find ways to spend that money. And so an 80% probability here is a fantastic probability. And you can see here, if you followed a guardrails scenario, you would actually squeeze out $255,000 more of income in just the first 10 years of your retirement, the time when it's probably the best spent on the youth and health that you can maintain during the best years of your retirement. Finally, we show a 70% guardrails situation. So again, a little more aggressive, but again, just to illustrate what you can get as you move out the risk curve. You'd have almost $300,000 difference in total spend in the first 10 years of retirement. And if you looked at the actual distribution rates against the portfolio value, they're still fairly modest. We're not talking about 7, 8, 9% distribution rates. We're hovering between 5.5 and 4.5, even at the riskiest end of the spectrum. At this point, I hope you understand that there are far superior distribution methods than the 4% rule. And while the 4% rule is interesting, it's been less and less applicable over time. And my opinion is it's far too conservative for most retirees, and it also is far too difficult to manage. All it really does is solve the decision-making friction issue, which allows people to move forward with a certain distribution rule, but again, lacks the context. Guardrails are a far superior method. They give you more flexibility, better rules to follow year by year. I think they're actually simpler to understand, and they'll allow you to squeeze significantly more money out of your saved assets, especially in the early years of your retirement. And so if you're looking for more information or want to know if you should consider guardrails, or just want to know how we help clients navigate the retirement risk zone and build retirement income strategies, you can visit our website at www.thepeakfp.com. As always, thanks for your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed the video, and see you in the next video.